There are some moments that television can never prepare you for. Moments when the script goes out the window, when the game becomes irrelevant, and when something so profound happens that everyone watching knows they're witnessing something unrepeatable. What happened when 8-year-old James Patterson stepped onto the Family Feud stage was one of those moments. He looked like any other grandfather, wearing a neat button-down shirt and khakis, his silver hair combed carefully to the side. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a weight, a heaviness that suggested this man was carrying something he'd been holding on to for a very long time. Harvey greeted him with his typical warmth and humor, making jokes, getting the audience laughing, building energy. But within minutes, James would say something that would leave Harvey completely speechless for 20 full seconds, standing frozen on stage while the audience sat in stunned silence. If you've ever held on to a secret that changed who you are, if you've ever carried guilt that shaped every decision you made, you need to hear what James Patterson had been waiting 60 years to say. Before we begin, if you believe in the power of truth and the courage it takes to finally speak it after decades of silence, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because we share real stories about real people facing real struggles. James Patterson was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1946. He grew up in the segregated South during a time when the color of your skin determined where you could eat, where you could go to school, where you could even drink water. His father worked in a steel mill, coming home every night covered in soot and exhaustion. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy white families, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. James was the oldest of 4 children, and from a young age, he understood that his job was to set an example, to stay out of trouble, to not make waves. His parents drilled this into him constantly. Keep your head down, his father would say. Don't give them any reason to notice you. That's how you survive. And for the most part, James listened. He was a good student, quiet and respectful. He didn't cause problems. He followed the rules, even the unjust ones that said he couldn't use the same bathroom as white children or drink from the same water fountain. He swallowed his anger and his questions because that's what his parents told him he had to do to stay safe. But in the summer of 1964, when James was 18 years old, something happened that would haunt him for the next 6 decades. It was a hot August afternoon, the kind of oppressive southern heat that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. James was walking home from his job at a grocery store where he stocked shelves and swept floors. He took the long way home that day, trying to avoid the main streets where white teenagers sometimes gathered to harass black kids walking alone. He cut through an alley between 2 buildings, and that's when he heard it. Voices, angry voices, and then a sound that made his blood run cold, someone crying out in pain. James should have kept walking. That's what his parents had taught him. That's what survival demanded. But something made him stop. Something made him peer around the corner to see what was happening. And what he saw would change everything. 3 white men, probably in their early 20s, had cornered a black teenager against a brick wall. They were beating him, taking turns hitting him while he tried to shield his face with his arms. The boy couldn't have been more than 15 years old. He was outnumbered, outmatched, terrified. And James stood there, hidden behind a dumpster watching. His heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might burst out of his chest. His hands were shaking. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to do something to help to intervene. But another voice, the voice of his father, the voice of survival, was telling him to run. If he helped this boy, those men would turn on him. They might kill him. This was 1964 in Birmingham, Alabama. Black people disappeared for less. Black people died for less. And James was 18 years old with his whole life ahead of him. He had plans. He was supposed to start at the local community college in 2 weeks. He was going to be the first person in his family to go to college. He couldn't throw that away. He couldn't risk his life for a stranger. So he ran. He turned around and he ran as fast as he could, the sound of that boy's cries echoing in his ears. He ran all the way home, burst through the door of his family's small house, and locked himself in the bathroom, where he threw up until there was nothing left in his stomach. When he came out, his mother asked him what was wrong. He told her he must have eaten something bad at lunch. He never told her the truth. He never told anyone the truth. The next day, James saw a small article buried in the back pages of the local newspaper. A 15-year-old black boy named Marcus Williams had been found unconscious in an alley downtown. He'd been beaten severely. He was in critical condition at the hospital. The article was only 3 sentences long, the kind of story that barely merited mention in a city where violence against black people was common enough to be routine. James cut that article out of the newspaper and kept it. He didn't know why at first. Maybe it was some kind of penance, some way of reminding himself of what he'd done, or rather, what he hadn't done. 3 days later, another small article appeared. Marcus Williams had died from his injuries. He'd never regained consciousness. The police said they had no leads, no witnesses. The case would remain unsolved. Marcus Williams became a statistic, another victim of racial violence in a time and place where such violence was endemic. But to James Patterson, Marcus Williams became something more. He became a ghost, a constant presence, a reminder of the moment when James had chosen his own safety over someone else's life. James tried to justify it to himself. He told himself there was nothing he could have done, that if he'd intervened those men would have killed them both, that he'd made the smart choice, the survival choice. He told himself that Marcus's death wasn't his fault, that he hadn't been the one wielding the fists and boots that killed a 15-year-old boy. But none of these rationalizations could erase what James knew in his heart. He had been there. He had seen what was happening. And he had chosen to save himself instead of trying to save Marcus Williams. This decision, this moment, shaped the rest of James Patterson's life in ways that no one around him could see. He went to college as planned, but he couldn't concentrate on his studies. He saw Marcus' face everywhere, in every young black man he passed on campus, in his dreams, in the mirror when he looked at himself. He started volunteering with civil rights organizations, throwing himself into activism with an intensity that surprised his friends and family. He marched, he protested, he organized. He was arrested twice during sit-ins, spent a night in jail each time. His parents begged him to be careful, to not put himself at risk, but James couldn't stop. It was as if he was trying to make up for that one moment of cowardice, trying to balance the scales, trying to prove to himself that he wasn't the person who had run away and let a boy die. He became a teacher, working in underprivileged schools, dedicating his life to educating young black children, trying to give them opportunities, trying to protect them from a world that saw them as disposable. He married a wonderful woman named Dorothy, who thought his dedication to his students was admirable, who never knew it came from a place of profound guilt. They had 3 children together, and James was a good father, present and loving, always making sure his kids knew they mattered, that their lives had value, that they should stand up for what was right. He told them stories about the civil rights movement, about people who had been brave when bravery meant risking everything. He never told them about the time he hadn't been brave, about the time he'd chosen safety over courage. For 60 years, James Patterson carried this secret. For 60 years, he lived with the knowledge that he could have tried to help Marcus Williams, and he hadn't. He didn't know if his intervention would have made a difference. Maybe those 3 men would have killed them both. Maybe his presence would have scared them off. He would never know, and that not knowing was perhaps the worst part. The guilt became a part of him, as fundamental as his bones, as constant as his heartbeat. It influenced every decision he made, every relationship he had, every moment of his life. He became the kind of person who never looked away from injustice, who always spoke up, who always intervened. But he knew it was all an attempt to make up for that one moment when he had looked away, when he had stayed silent, when he had run. His wife Dorothy died 2 years ago from cancer. In her final weeks, James almost told her. He sat by her hospital bed, holding her hand, and the words were right there, desperate to come out after being held in for so long. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't burden her with his guilt when she was already carrying so much. So the secret stayed locked inside him, and Dorothy died never knowing the truth about the man she'd spent 53 years married to. After she passed, James fell into a deep depression. His children worried about him. They tried to get him out of the house, to engage with life again, to find reasons to keep going. His youngest daughter, Patricia, was a huge Family Feud fan, and she thought that applying to be on the show might give her father something to look forward to, something to break him out of his grief. James agreed to do it mostly to make his children happy, to show them he was trying. He didn't expect it to mean anything. He certainly didn't expect it to become the moment when he would finally, after 60 years, tell the truth. The Patterson family arrived at the Family Feud studio on a Tuesday morning. James's 3 children were with him, along with 2 of his grandchildren. They were excited, energetic, treating it like an adventure. James was quiet, going through the motions, letting his family's enthusiasm carry him along. When Steve Harvey came out and started his introductions, making jokes and working the crowd, James found himself smiling despite himself. There was something about Steve's energy, his authenticity, his way of connecting with people that felt genuine. When Steve got to James and asked him to introduce himself, James said simply, "I'm James Patterson. I'm 78 years old. I was a teacher for 45 years, and I have 3 children and 6 grandchildren who mean the world to me." Steve smiled warmly. A teacher for 45 years. Man, that's incredible. Teachers don't get enough credit for what they do. What did you teach? James said, history. American history. I wanted my students to understand where we came from so they could better understand where we're going. Steve nodded appreciatively. That's beautiful. That's important work right there. And 78 years old. You look great. What's kept you going all these years? It was meant to be a light question, the kind of question Steve asked contestants all the time to keep the energy up and the conversation flowing. But something in James shifted. Something that had been locked away for 60 years suddenly demanded to be released. James looked at Steve Harvey, and his eyes filled with tears. Can I tell you something? James asked, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. Steve's expression changed immediately. He could sense something serious was happening. Of course, Mr. Patterson. Take your time. James looked at his children standing next to him. They looked confused, concerned. They'd never seen their father like this, on the verge of breaking down. He looked back at Steve. I've been holding on to something for 60 years, James said, his voice shaking. And I don't think I can hold it anymore. I don't think I'm supposed to hold it anymore. Do you believe in signs? Do you believe that sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there? Steve nodded slowly, fully present now, giving James his complete attention. I do believe that. What is it you need to say, Mr. Patterson? James took a deep breath. The studio had gone completely quiet. Even the crew, who had seen thousands of contestants and hundreds of emotional moments, could sense this was different. In 1964, James began. I was 18 years old, living in Birmingham, Alabama. One day, I witnessed 3 white men beating a young black boy in an alley. He was 15 years old. His name was Marcus Williams, and I didn't help him. I ran away because I was scared. 3 days later, Marcus Williams died from his injuries. I was the only witness, and I never came forward. I never told the police what I saw. I let those men get away with murder because I was too afraid to speak up. The audience gasped collectively. Some people audibly drew in breath. Steve Harvey stood completely still, his eyes locked on James, his face showing a mixture of shock, compassion, and something else, recognition perhaps, of the weight of what he was hearing. James continued, tears now streaming down his face. For 60 years, I've carried this guilt. For 60 years, I've tried to make up for it by fighting for justice, by teaching children, by never looking away from injustice again. But nothing I've done has ever erased what I didn't do that day. Nothing has ever brought Marcus Williams back. Nothing has ever made it right. His daughter Patricia stepped forward and put her hand on her father's shoulder. Dad, she said softly, you never told us. James looked at her. How could I? How could I tell my children that their father was a coward? That when it mattered most, when someone's life was on the line, I chose my own safety over trying to help. Steve Harvey still hadn't said anything. He stood there, and for 20 full seconds, he was completely silent, just looking at James with an expression of profound emotion. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. The audience didn't move. The cameras kept rolling, capturing this raw, unscripted moment. Finally, Steve spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Patterson, how old did you say you were when this happened? James wiped his eyes. 18. Steve nodded slowly. 18 years old. Still basically a child yourself. Living in Birmingham, Alabama in 1964, which was one of the most dangerous places in America for a black person to be. You witnessed 3 grown men, violent men, men who had already shown they were willing to kill, and you were alone, unarmed, and you made the decision to survive. James shook his head. I should have done something. I should have tried. Steve took a step closer. Maybe, or maybe you would have died too. Maybe instead of 1 dead 15-year-old, there would have been 2. Maybe those men would have killed you both and still gotten away with it. You don't know. You'll never know. And you've been torturing yourself with that uncertainty for 60 years. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But let me tell you what I do know. I know that you've spent the last 60 years trying to make it right. You became a teacher. You dedicated your life to helping young black children. You fought for civil rights. You raised children who clearly love you and respect you. You've lived a life of service and justice. That doesn't erase what happened to Marcus Williams. Nothing can. But it means something. It has to mean something. James was crying openly now. I just wish I could have been braver. I wish I could have been the kind of person who didn't run. Steve Harvey's voice grew stronger. You were 18 years old in the Jim Crow South, and you survived. That took courage too. And then you spent the rest of your life being brave, over and over again in every way you could. That has to count for something. James looked at Steve with desperate hope in his eyes. Do you really believe that? Steve nodded. I do. I absolutely do. Because I know what it's like to carry guilt, to feel like you didn't do enough, to wish you could go back and change one moment that haunts you. We all carry things like that. But the question isn't whether we made mistakes or failed to be as brave as we wish we'd been. The question is what we did next. And what you did next was spend 60 years fighting for justice, teaching children, trying to make the world better. That matters, Mr. Patterson. That really matters. Patricia spoke up again. Dad, why didn't you ever tell us? James turned to his children. Because I was ashamed. Because I didn't want you to know that your father was capable of such cowardice. I wanted you to think I was better than I am. His son Michael stepped forward. Dad, you're better than you think you are. You're the best man I know. You taught us to stand up for what's right, to fight for justice, to never look away from injustice. And now I understand why those lessons were so important to you. Not because you were perfect, but because you knew the cost of silence, the weight of inaction. You taught us those lessons from a place of deep personal understanding, and that makes them even more powerful. Steve Harvey addressed the audience and the cameras. This man right here just did something that takes more courage than most of us will ever have to show. He just told the truth about the worst moment of his life. He just exposed his deepest shame to millions of people. And why? Because he needed to finally say it out loud. Because carrying it alone for 60 years was killing him. Because sometimes the only way to find peace is to speak the truth, no matter how hard it is. He turned back to James. Mr. Patterson, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What happened to Marcus Williams was a tragedy. An absolute tragedy. And you were there, and you didn't intervene, and that's something you've had to live with. But those 3 men killed Marcus Williams. Not you. They beat him to death. They made the choice to take his life. You made the choice to survive. Those are not the same thing. James was shaking his head, but Steve continued. I know you don't believe that yet. I know you've spent 60 years blaming yourself. But I need you to hear this. You were a child, outnumbered, in a time and place where black lives were treated as worthless by the system that was supposed to protect them. If you had intervened, there's a very real chance you would have died too. And then what? Your students wouldn't have had you as their teacher. Your wife wouldn't have had you as her husband. Your children wouldn't exist. Your grandchildren wouldn't exist. All the good you've done in the world, all the lives you've touched and changed and improved, none of that would have happened. Is that what Marcus Williams would have wanted? For you to die too? This question seemed to strike James deeply. He stood there, processing it, and for the first time in 60 years, something in his expression shifted. I never thought about it like that, he said quietly. Steve nodded. I know you haven't, because guilt doesn't let us think clearly. Guilt just tells us we failed, over and over again, without letting us see the full picture. But Mr. Patterson, you need to forgive yourself. Not because what happened wasn't terrible, it was. Not because you don't wish you could have been braver, I'm sure you do. But because you've paid enough. 60 years is long enough to carry this burden. It's time to put it down. The audience was completely silent, many people openly crying. James's children had their arms around their father, forming a protective circle. Steve looked at the cameras again. I need everyone watching this to understand something. This is what shame does to people. This is what carrying secrets does. It eats away at you for decades. It influences every decision you make. It makes you unable to see your own worth, your own goodness, because all you can see is that one moment of failure. But we are not defined by our worst moments. We're defined by what we do with the rest of our lives. And James Patterson spent his life trying to make things right, trying to protect other young people, trying to fight for justice. That's who he is. Not an 18-year-old kid who ran away in fear, but a man who dedicated his entire life to making sure that fear never stopped him again. Steve walked over and put his hand on James's shoulder. I want you to do something for me, Mr. Patterson. I want you to imagine what you would say to Marcus Williams, if you could talk to him right now. What would you say? James closed his eyes, tears still streaming down his face. When he spoke, his voice was raw and broken. I would say I'm sorry. I would say I thought about him every single day for 60 years. I would say that I wish I had been braver, that I wish I had tried to help, that I wish things had been different. And I would tell him that I've tried to honor his memory by fighting for other young people like him, by making sure his death wasn't completely meaningless. Steve nodded. And what do you think Marcus would say back to you? James opened his eyes, and for the first time, there was a hint of something other than guilt in his expression. Maybe hope, maybe peace, maybe just the beginning of forgiveness. I think, he said slowly, I think maybe he would tell me that he understood, that he knew I was just a kid too, that he didn't blame me for wanting to live. Steve smiled gently. I think you're right. I think that's exactly what he would say. Because 15-year-old Marcus Williams knew what it was like to be scared in Birmingham in 1964. He knew what it was like to be young and vulnerable and black in a place where that could get you killed. He would have understood your fear because he felt that same fear every day of his life. James nodded and something in him seemed to break open, not in a bad way, but in a way that suggested a dam that had been holding back 60 years of pain was finally releasing. He sobbed deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body, and his children held him while he cried. Harvey stood by, giving them space, giving James the time he needed to finally let it out. When James finally composed himself enough to speak, he looked at Steve with red, swollen eyes. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for letting me say this. Thank you for not judging me. Thank you for helping me see it differently." Steve shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You're the one who had the courage to speak the truth. That's all you. That's all your courage." The show didn't resume normally after that. Steve talked with James and his family for another 20 minutes, off camera mostly, but with the audience still present. He shared his own stories of regret, of moments he wished he could change, of guilt he'd carried. He talked about forgiveness, about grace, about the importance of being honest about our failures so they don't consume us. When the taping finally ended, over half the audience came down to hug James, to tell him they understood, to thank him for his honesty. Many of them shared their own stories of guilt and regret, of moments they wished they could change. It became an impromptu therapy session, a collective acknowledgement that we all carry things we're ashamed of, and that speaking them out loud is often the first step toward healing. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and it became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's history. The clip of James's confession and Steve's response went viral, viewed over 50 million times in the first week. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. "This man has been punishing himself for 60 years for something that wasn't his fault," one person wrote. "I hope he can finally find peace." Another comment read, "Steve Harvey handled this with such grace and wisdom. This is what television should be: real moments, real people, real healing." Therapists and counselors used the clip in their practices as an example of how carrying guilt can impact an entire life, and how important it is to speak the truth and seek forgiveness, from others and from ourselves. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the episode aired, James received a letter. It was from a woman named Sarah Williams, who identified herself as Marcus Williams's younger sister. She was 74 years old now, but she remembered her brother clearly. She remembered the day he didn't come home, the police coming to their door, her mother's screams when they told her Marcus was dead. She remembered the funeral, the injustice of how little investigation there was, how quickly everyone seemed to forget about her brother except their family. She had watched the Family Feud episode, she wrote, and she needed James to know something. "My brother would not want you to carry this guilt," she wrote. "Marcus was a gentle soul, kind and forgiving. He would understand your fear. He felt that same fear every day of his young life. He would not blame you for surviving. He would want you to forgive yourself and live fully, the way he never got to. Your dedication to teaching young people, to fighting for justice, that's a beautiful way to honor his memory. Please stop punishing yourself. Please find peace. That's what Marcus would want. That's what I want for you too." James called Sarah, and they talked for 2 hours. She told him stories about Marcus, about what he was like as a child, about his dreams of becoming a musician, about how much he loved his family. James told her about every student he'd taught who reminded him of Marcus, about the scholarships he'd quietly funded over the years for young black students, about his lifetime of activism and work. They cried together, and then they laughed together, and by the end of the conversation, something had shifted for both of them. James felt a weight he'd been carrying begin to lift. Sarah felt like her brother's death, while still a tragedy, had inadvertently inspired a lifetime of good work. They agreed to meet in person, and 3 months later, James flew to Alabama to visit Sarah and what remained of Marcus Williams's family. At that meeting, surrounded by Marcus' relatives, James told them everything he remembered about that day. He told them exactly where it happened, what Marcus was wearing, every detail he'd kept locked inside for 6 decades. The family listened quietly, some of them crying, all of them grateful to finally have some answers about what happened to their brother, their uncle, their family member. And then Sarah did something that James never expected. She forgave him. Explicitly, formally, she said, "James Patterson, on behalf of my brother Marcus and our family, we forgive you. We don't blame you. We understand, and we're grateful for the life you've lived in his memory." James collapsed into sobs, and the Williams family surrounded him, holding him, offering him the grace and forgiveness he'd been unable to give himself for 60 years. The story of James Patterson became more than just a viral video. It became a catalyst for important conversations about guilt, about trauma, about how historical oppression creates impossible situations where there are no good choices, only survival. It sparked discussions about how we judge people for their actions without understanding the context they were operating in, the dangers they faced, the limited options they had. It reminded people that everyone is carrying something, everyone has moments they regret, and that judgment should be tempered with compassion. James spent his remaining years different from before. The weight was gone. He still thought about Marcus Williams every day, but now those thoughts were tinged with peace rather than guilt. He spoke at schools and churches about his experience, using his story to teach young people about the importance of speaking truth, of seeking forgiveness, of not letting guilt consume your entire life. He established a scholarship in Marcus Williams's name at the high school where Marcus would have graduated. He worked with Sarah Williams to create a memorial for her brother, a small plaque in Birmingham that acknowledged Marcus' life and death. And he finally, after 60 years, allowed himself to believe that he was a good man who had made a mistake in an impossible situation, rather than a coward who had failed in the most important moment. Steve Harvey stayed in touch with James. They would talk on the phone every few months, checking in, sharing life updates. Steve said that meeting James had changed him too, had reminded him of the power of grace, of listening, of allowing people to speak their truth without judgment. That day on Family Feud, Steve said in an interview later, James Patterson gave us all a gift. He showed us what courage really looks like. Not the courage to intervene in that alley 60 years ago, though that would have been courageous too, but the courage to finally tell the truth, to expose his deepest shame, to seek forgiveness and healing after 6 decades of silence. That's the kind of courage most of us will never have to show, and I'm grateful I got to witness it. James Patterson passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, 3 years after his appearance on Family Feud. At his funeral, Sarah Williams stood up to speak. She talked about how her brother's death had been a tragedy that shaped her entire life, but how James Patterson had turned that tragedy into something meaningful. She talked about the hundreds of students James had taught and influenced, about his lifetime of activism and service, about how he had honored Marcus' memory in the best way he knew how. And she said something that brought everyone in the room to tears. My brother Marcus was killed by hate and violence when he was only 15 years old. But through James Patterson, Marcus' legacy became about love, education, justice, and redemption. That's not nothing. That matters. And I believe, wherever Marcus is, he knows that his death wasn't meaningless. James made sure of that. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the things you carry and the forgiveness you might need to seek or offer, please hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to our channel because we need more stories like this, stories that remind us that we're all human. We all make mistakes, we all carry regrets, and we all deserve the chance to find peace. James Patterson waited 60 years to speak his truth, and when he finally did, he found the forgiveness and healing he'd been desperately seeking. His story reminds us that it's never too late to be honest, never too late to seek redemption, never too late to put down the burdens we've been carrying for far too long. That's the legacy of James Patterson, and it's a legacy that continues to inspire people to this day.